Hello, my name is John Combs. I am a securities entertainment attorney. I've been working in this narrow area of the law, which I call investor financing of independent film or securities compliance for low budget independent feature films and documentaries, for about 35 years, 23 in Los Angeles, where I lectured extensively and throughout the country for universities and independent film groups. My entire bio, and I won't go through it here, but my entire bio is online at filmfinanceattorney.com, so you can check that out. Also at the website, there are sample film industry contracts, a checklist for legal and business affairs type tasks that producers undertake when they finance and produce a feature film. There are articles there, some 35 articles that I've written over the years about this topic, various aspects of it. The list of my 20 books that I've written and produced over the years is there. Most recent is Investor Financing of Independent Film. So there's a lot of information that's available. So take advantage of it and use it. Now, I've also included my contact information here. If you've got a question, I'm happy to hear from filmmakers who are threatening to make a film. Now, this presentation is part of a series. I originally did a 50-minute presentation on investor financing of independent film. I was encouraged then to break it up into chunks. And so that's what I'm doing. And this is the first of those. There'll be 6 that follow on related topics. And this is what is a security. It's a very important bit of information for independent filmmakers. They need to know whether they're selling a security or not. And I'm going to try to clear that up for everybody with this presentation. So it is a series. Why am I doing it? One of the things that prompted me to put this on YouTube was that from time to time I do a little survey of who's saying what about film finance, just so I can kind of keep up with what people are thinking. And so I did what I call a YouTube survey of film finance posts. And I saw about 6 films of varying lengths. Almost all the presenters were producers who've had some experience in film finance. One was a combination producer and professor. And they had various levels of expertise. But one of the things they all agreed on, I think is really significant, is that most low-budget independent films are investor financed. And that's important to note. And I agree with that. That's a fair statement. Now, one of the presenters went so far as to say 99% of independent films are investor financed, but he has no way of knowing that. Nobody does. Nobody calls 2,000 filmmakers every year and say, how did you produce your film? Some of them tell you, none of your business and other things. But there are things that they did not tell us, and that's what we're going to talk about here in a moment. Here are some things that those presenters did not tell us. Not only are most independent, low-budget independent films produced with investor funds, but most investor offerings for independent films involve the sale of a security. And you probably didn't know that. And a lot of filmmakers don't know that. But most investor offerings for independent films involve the sale of security, and we'll explain why in a minute. Now, also, many, if not most, of these independent producers don't know they're selling a security. So that's what I mentioned that. As a result, it's very unlikely that they would be able to comply with the securities laws. They don't even know they're selling security. So that's part of why I'm doing this. Now, none of these so-called experts, and in all fairness, they didn't call themselves experts. I don't call myself an expert. We have varying levels of expertise in this very narrow field. But none of these people even mention the need for securities compliance. That, to me, is a significant omission, and a lot of filmmakers could get in trouble just because they weren't given the complete story about investor financing. So let's define what a security is. And we're going to rely on the federal law, in this case, a statute called the 33 Securities Act, or the Securities Act of 1933, which defines a security as a series of financial transactions or instruments. And so that's not a very good definition as definitions go. It's just a list of various agreements, one of which was the profit participation agreement. But unfortunately, no courts have come up with a definition for a profit participation agreement that can be that's recognized universally. But one case, or another, I should say, another instrument or agreement in that definition, the federal definition of security, is investment contract. And that was the subject of litigation that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court came down and said, hey, here's what an investment contract is. And of course, an investment contract is always a security. It's an investment of money. Of course, that's what investors do. They invest money in a common enterprise. In the case we're talking about a producer and one or more investors pooling their resources, money and talent and capabilities, and engaging in this common enterprise of financing and producing a film. And so investment of money, common enterprise, expectation of profits. Both the producer and the investors hope to make money off of this transaction. And then the fourth element is that those profits would be derived primarily from the efforts of others. Now, when I first started lecturing about film finance and about securities compliance in Los Angeles some years ago, a lot of independent producers, some coming from all over parts of the country, they asked me to try to simplify that a little bit because it was a little cumbersome, 4 elements, and having to apply that in real life. And so I looked at it and I thought, those first 3 are things that are implicit in being an investor in any kind of investor transaction. They invest money into a common enterprise and hope to make a profit. So the word investor by itself can basically implies those first 3. And then the fourth element of the Howey case, derived primarily from the efforts of others, that means the investor or investors are passive. They're not actively involved in making decisions. They don't control the project. They're passive investors. And so the truth is, you can take those 4 elements and reduce it down to 2 words: passive investor or passive investors. Okay. So anytime you have passive investors, you're raising money from passive investors, no matter what it's for, feature films, documentaries, and this doesn't apply just to the film industry. This is for entrepreneurial businesses of all kinds all over the country. You're selling a security if you're raising money from passive investors. So that's important to know. Now, I kind of stumbled into this myself in an effort to help independent producers understand the concept of what is a security. But I found out later when I was doing research for an article that was published in Los Angeles Lawyer magazine that a couple of federal courts have actually, come across the same distinction, the active versus passive investor distinction. And so case law supports that. So those cases are cited in that article for Los Angeles Lawyer magazine. And they're also cited in my book, Investor Financing of Independent Film, because I republished those articles in that book with permission from the magazine. So let's work on defining the next thing we have to do. I mean, what is a security? And, then we get to the distinction between active and passive investors. So let's define passive and active investors. Now, the first one, passive investors, that's easy. What is a passive investor? They're not active. That's it. What is a passive investor? They're not active. So the more difficult thing is defining what an active investor is. And again, we go to the case law. Now remember, and I just mentioned this, there's an old saying in law, no citation, no credibility. So I'm giving you citations where you can look this up yourself and go check it out and make sure that anybody's interpretation is appropriate. But now that's a little bit of an exaggeration. No credibility, no citation, no credibility. A little bit of an exaggeration, because you can still be credible without citations as long as your information is accurate. But if your information is not accurate, well, and you have no citations, no credibility. So, just an aside. Now, defining the active investor. That is someone with sufficient knowledge and experience in the relevant field. In this case, feature film, the film industry. Sufficient knowledge and experience in the relevant field. that allows them to play a meaningful role in helping to make the important decisions associated with the project. Now, immediately, a lot of independent filmmakers say, well, I don't want my investors to be involved in helping make decisions. And we'll talk some more about the pros and cons later. But that's the definition of an active investor, okay? Furthermore, you have to think, well, okay, they must be willing to participate in decision making. A lot of investors don't really want to be involved in decision making. And you have to want them to participate. Now, a lot of independent producers don't want investors to participate in the decision making. So you have to have all three of those, or four of those, and back to four elements again, to get an active investor. Now, if you actually choose to go that route and you actually raise money from a few active investors, I would suggest that the best practice is for you to document all along the way what decisions those investors participated in making. So you got an exchange of emails and so forth back and forth, and tell them, oh, here's the question we're working on now. What do you think? And here are our options. And you create this paper trail to show that, yes, they actively participated in decision making, because you can't pretend they're active to avoid the securities laws and then not let them be active. And they have to qualify to be active. Now, is it easy to find these active investors? No, it's not. You could say it's impossible, but I won't go there. They are difficult to find. They're few and far between. And they're not really in the film industry currently because people currently work in the film industry tend not to be investors in low-budget independent feature films. You know what they do? They want to acquire rights. And when they acquire the rights, then you're fired. Or the other option, the other thing that I've actually seen happen with one of my clients is that you pitch a project to an established entity in Hollywood, and they say, well, we're not, we love the project, but we're not interested in co-producing with you guys because you don't have much experience. And so we'll pass. And then 2 or 3 years later, you see a film that obviously was derivative of your project on the screen. It's been rewritten, script's been rewritten 5 or 6 times, and it goes on to make a lot of money. And as I said, I've seen that happen. But these active investors might have worked in the film industry in the past. I mean, how else do you get knowledge and experience in the film industry unless you're an academic? And that's maybe you could get knowledge and experience that way as an academic, because some do work in the industry. But so it's hard to find these active investors. There are advantages and disadvantages, so let's be honest and fair about it. If you go the active investor route, there are not as many investors needed. In fact, you don't want very many. And you might actually find an active investor who has legitimate experience and knowledge of the film industry and can be quite helpful in helping you make those important decisions. That's possible. Not likely, but possible. The disadvantage, sometimes they interfere with the producer's creative vision. They tell you they want their wife, girlfriend, daughter to be the star, and they put up half the money or a third of the money. That's tough. That's a tough position for a producer to be in. So you might want to try to avoid that. The other thing is, if you get too many, if you pretend all of your investors are active, they qualify as active investors, and they're going to participate actively in the decision making, it's quite likely that one or more are not actually active, meet the definition of an active investor, in which case you're now back selling a security and you need to comply with securities laws. So that's a little bit of a problem. Now, the advantages and disadvantages of the passive investors, this allows you, the producer, to spread the risk amongst a larger group of investors. So the unit price is going to be smaller. You can raise funds with a smaller unit price. Another thing is that passive investors do not participate in decision making. They're told right up front in writing, you're not going to be part of the decision making. All the decisions are going to be made by the manager, if you're using a manager-managed LLC, which is typical these days. And the other thing is, or another way of saying it is, that passive investors do not interfere with your creative vision. And that's, from a lot of independent producer standpoint, that's desirable. Disadvantages, you're selling a security. You need to comply with securities laws. There are consequences. I've got one whole presentation later in this series that focuses on what could happen if you don't comply with securities laws. And it's a little more expensive. Now, this is one of the reasons why a lot of independent filmmakers try to avoid selling the security or try to figure out a way to avoid, coming within the jurisdiction of the Securities and Exchange Commission, because some law firms, certainly the bigger law firms, charge a lot of money for doing this kind of work. Preparing the disclosure document and subscription agreement and advising you about notice filings and that sort of thing. So it could be a little more expensive. So look around. I'm saying, get out there and talk to these entertainment attorneys or people who hold themselves out who have securities expertise, attorneys, and find out what they charge and how they charge. And, do they charge on an hourly fee basis? Do they require a retainer that they bill against? Is it done on a flat fee basis? Is anything deferred? Those are all legitimate questions you want to talk to these folks about. How many offerings have they done? How many successful films have their clients produced over the years? Those are all legitimate questions. But that's a disadvantage. It's a little more expensive, a little more complicated than breaking the law, but so what? Now people will say, well, gee, we don't want to, we don't have to do this, and that's true. You don't have to comply with traffic laws either, but there could be consequences. So you need to be careful who you listen to. That's a common theme that'll be running throughout this presentation. Now, let's summarize where we've been, and we're getting close to the end of this segment. We talked about the fact that I did this YouTube survey, and we determined that most independent films, low-budget independent films, were produced with money raised from investors. We talked about the definition of the term security and finally boiled it down to just two words: passive investors. And then we made the distinction between active and passive investors. We learned that passive investors are not active. We learned that active investors have to have sufficient knowledge and experience in this field to play a significant role in helping them make important decisions. And we talked about the pros and cons of active versus passive investors. And we concluded the bottom line is, if you're raising money from passive investors, you're selling a security. And my recommendation is you comply with the laws relating to the sale of a security. Now, these are the other topics that are coming up. I haven't done these presentations yet, but I will in the weeks ahead. We're talking about securities compliance, a little segment there. And then there's this huge controversy and dispute amongst a lot of filmmakers and people in the industry about disclosure. What kind of disclosure are you required to provide? Or a separate question, what kind of disclosure should you provide? What is safer, or which approach is riskier? So we'll get into that. And then I've got a whole presentation on what happens if you don't comply with securities laws, what could happen, I should say. And then notice filings is something a lot of people don't know about. That we'll talk about. And then financial projections. Most people don't know that the SEC has a policy on financial projections, and I run into this from time to time in the industry. And then another interesting topic is finder's fees, because a lot of independent producers are saying, well, I need some help raising the money, so why can't I pay finder's fees? Well, we're going to cover that, and that's another very tricky area. So I hope this has been informative. In a very narrow sense, just the question of what is a security, and I hope you now understand that. Again, if you have questions, feel free to give me a call or send me an email, and I hope to see you on the next presentation.